Indian culture, yes, very, very nice, good, but it's something of the past. And we don't really need it today to get a job, right? All the knowledge that you have in your school textbooks basically is knowledge that comes from the West. And rarely are you told anything that India would have contributed in a major way. By saying that Indian democracy was born in 1947, well, excuse me, but I have to disagree. Indian democracy is rooted in very ancient democratic traditions. It doesn't mean that people went to a voting booth and cast their vote. No, it was not functioning like this. So the practical attitude are, first of all, sacredness of creation and all, whether it's mountains, rivers or forest, interconnectedness of all creature. This is a philosophical context common to Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, that we are all interconnected, even with very humble creatures. Show a few things that India did not contribute to the world. This is just for fun. Wars of religion. Colonial conquest or plunder, of course not. Slave trade has not existed in India. No genocides as far as we know. And no concentration camps and no world wars originated out of India. So you can see that my whole point is that I'm not trying to say India is great, the West is not. No, they are not interested in saying that this is superior, this is inferior. Good morning, namaste everyone, and I would like to share a few thoughts on Indian civilization. In fact, a few of you in the preceding session kept asking my colleague Dr. Prabhakar, what is the use of archaeology, what is the use of studying the past, how can it help us today? All these questions came, and they are very valid questions, right? Because apparently you don't get a job out of this. But there's something more. There's the fact that you belong to a certain country, you belong to a certain, we call it a civilization. Why? Perhaps we will see a little bit why. And it's not created in 1947 out of the void. It's not an empty slate. There's a whole past, and this past is still with us. The past is never quite dead. So if we don't understand the past, we cannot really understand the present. And therefore, I've tried to, because we are in India, we could do a similar exercise maybe if we were in Greece or, in a few other parts of the world. The Japanese are proud of their civilization, the Chinese also. There are, of course, different value systems there, but in India, there are certain special things happening. And the purpose of this talk is basically to highlight a few master ideas, some important concepts, realizations, achievements of Indian civilization. And I hope in the process you can recognize a few things which are still with us today, or are still living in some modified ways sometimes, right? And I'll do my best to show those examples as I go along. Now, before I start, I want to dwell on one thing. We are always saying we should be proud of being Indians. And at school, I'm sure during your school days, you were told again and again, let us be proud of our country. That's very fine as a concept. But the question is, what is this pride created on? And I find personally that generally, there's no doubt that Indians are very patriotic. You can see it during cricket matches, you can see it on many occasions. Of course, if there is a war with the neighbors or some skirmishes. But this patriotism sometimes goes also overboard, and because it is not really founded on knowledge. It's not really created on a foundation of understanding of this whole set of concepts and realizations that make India what India is. So it's often tainted with ignorance. So personally, I prefer pride founded on knowledge, and this has been my purpose in this years of journey through Indian civilization, history, archaeology, and so on, and study of some of the knowledge systems, as we call them, that I would like young Indians to acquire some understanding. It's not about detailed knowledge. And I'm not going to spend much time on these master ideas. I'll just outline them very, very briefly, because each of them, and I've selected 12, I could have selected 20 or maybe 40, but each of them could be developed into a whole semester course, or even sometimes into a whole graduate course. Why not? So therefore, it's going to be a very quick journey, but I'll be more spending time on the ideas and concepts. And this is my purpose. What I always say is that if, young Indians, and why not also older Indians, can acquire a little bit of that understanding and knowledge, the pride comes automatically. You don't have to bother about it. You don't have to call for Indians to be proud of their country. And it's not also about being proud. Sometimes also we should be ashamed of our country, because there are obviously things that in the society that are not always so, as ideal as we would like them to be. Far from it, of course. So therefore, I am not develop these concepts further. Maybe I'll come back to it towards the end. We start with also a quick look at some stereotypes, because this I encounter. See, I've been teaching for many years, not only at IIT Gandhinagar, but earlier in some other institutions, and I find that my students come with a certain number of preconceived ideas. They are collected from various scholars, they are collected from the popular press, they are collected from even school textbooks at times, and these are the following which I'm listing. First of all, Indian culture, yes, very, very nice, good, but it's something of the past. And we don't really need it today to get a job, right? All the knowledge that you have in your school textbooks basically is knowledge that comes from the West. And rarely are you told anything that India would have contributed in a major way. Okay, the national education policy is aiming at changing that, because there's so much of real knowledge that emerged from this land that, it's not natural for students to know. But this prejudice is there. And this is one thing which has to be, of course, challenged. If at all Indian culture is acknowledged, there's an idea that it's about religiosity, about spirituality, about worshipping and this and that. And again, not something very, very useful in day-to-day life. This is something that is quite easy to challenge, because there's an enormous material development of the civilization. You just heard one brilliant talk about the Harappan civilization, and this, of course, can be prolonged in Indian history. Then these strong prejudices that ancient India and its society were stagnant, they were decadent, they were exclusionist, the caste system, exclusion and all that. They were elitist. An elite managed to get the reins of power and control the whole country and so on. These ideas are all very crude. They do not correspond. The deeper you study history, the more you see that the society is complex and responds in much more elaborate ways than this. And when there is also the other extreme, there are, our patriots or enthusiasts who will tell you that ancient India, just read Mahabharata, Ramayana, and obviously it's all about glory, and it was a very ideal place and so on, which of course is equally incorrect. So therefore, once we understand all these wrong ideas, we can start our journey. Now, the first step of the journey, Dr. Prabhakar has already done it. So I'm not going to repeat, of course, what he said, and I would not be competent to. You've seen something of this map. We are in the 3rd millennium BC. So let's say really roughly begins about 5,000 years ago. I just want to highlight a few points which Dr. Prabhakar also mentioned. First of all, it's remarkable that we have a very extensive civilization, and there is nowhere a single trace of warfare. We can't rule out some local skirmishes, maybe some local confrontations, but there is nothing like weapons of warfare, evidence of human destruction of cities, sacking of cities, and so on. So how can such a large civilization have been so peaceful, apparently, at least without wars, for 700 years at least, when ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, is not only full of war, but glorifying war? So this is a question we have to ask. There's a certain, of course, we can say trade, and people understand that they can benefit from peace, they can be more prosperous during peacetime. All of that, yes, but nevertheless, it's not so common among ancient civilizations of the world. Similarly, we don't have any glorification of the rulers. See, in Egypt again, you have the pharaoh, you have kings in Greece, in Mesopotamia. There must have been rulers. Of course they were. But we know next to nothing about them. They are not glorified, they are not depicted. And okay, we don't have the script, but altogether the rulers are surprisingly discreet. The palaces are not, if at all there are palaces, I mean, archaeologists have tried to identify some major buildings as palaces, but they don't exactly stand out in terms of architecture, for example. High technological achievements, I will not repeat what Dr. Prabhakar said. Civic discipline. See, we are always told that Indians have no civic sense. Have you heard that, some of you? You know, they'll throw garbage in the street, they won't respect driving rules, etc. No civic sense. But you find a lot of civic sense in the Harappan civilization. During the mature phase, the urban phase, most of the streets in the major cities at least had no encroachments. Mohenjo-daro had huge garbage bins, in fact, made of clay at regular intervals on the larger streets. Sanitation system could not have worked in such a packed urban context without enough of collective discipline and so on. So there is something interesting here, which of course is a bit subjective to assess, but which gives us another perspective. And then, as far as we can tell, economic prosperity. Because of the trade, because of all their manufacturing crafts, the Harappans seems to have enjoyed a relative prosperity. So finally, you have seen these interactions which Dr. Prabhakar mentioned, and we will see a map a little later. Again, there is absence of warfare inside, but also the contact with the other civilizations of the same Bronze Age are peaceful. Whereas, for example, Egypt was at war with Mesopotamia, Greece was at war with other neighboring civilizations, eventually with the Roman Empire and so on. So this is something that we need to understand. Why was it this way? And finally, again, Dr. Prabhakar mentioned this point, there is a broad cultural integration of the entire territory of the Harappan or Indus-Sarasvati civilization over the entire northwest, including, of course, today's Pakistan, even bits of Afghanistan, and so on. And there were certain standards of urbanism, of way system, of craft techniques, and so on, and the script, of course, which were shared over this whole geography, which is almost 1 million, roughly 1 million square kilometers, so quite a huge area, 1/3 of modern India, you might say, roughly. So these are unique features which have to be understood, discussed, explored further, and they already kind of give a stamp to certain aspects of the future civilization of India. And then now we jump almost 2,000 years, and we come to what historians call the early historical period of India, let's say first millennium BC. So Harappan was 3rd millennium BC, now we jump into the first. And we see that, you know, this is the age where kingdoms appear, empires will be consolidating. You've all heard about, at least, you know, Mauryan Empire and such terms. And then a lot of things happen which are sometimes in continuity with the Harappan civilization, sometimes also there are innovations. And one thing which is very difficult to trace in the Harappan world, because there is no literature and no data, is this concept of ancient democracy. Now, I've seen textbooks, and this is a picture of one, which begin by saying that Indian democracy was born in 1947. Well, excuse me, but I have to disagree. Indian democracy is rooted in very ancient democratic traditions. It doesn't mean that people went to a voting booth and cast their vote. No, it was not functioning like this. But there were all kinds of institutions, and we see some traces of them in the early literature, which have been called assemblies, sabha, samiti. And they are found in the literature, but also sometimes in inscriptions, which will tell us, and again, I'm not going into details, a lot of functioning of those assemblies. So what are those assemblies? Some of them start at the village level, and sometimes at the city level, and also at the level of the court, the ruler. the king or sometimes exceptionally the queen. And in these assemblies, there is room for representation, for discussion, for hearing the voice of the people. That is what democracy is supposed to mean, after all. Demo, peoplecracy, rule. So I'm not saying that the people rule, that would be too ideal a statement, but it means that they had a way to get their voice heard, and that's what matters. So a lot of such institutions develop, and they start from the Gangetic region. Slowly they spread all over. In Tamil Nadu, for example, there's a lot of literature and inscriptions about assembly systems under the Cholas, for example, and we know exactly, more or less, how it was functioning and how the members of those assemblies were elected, etc. But it was not limited to assemblies. For example, the Buddhist Sangha, the monastic institution that was the backbone of Buddhism in India, was also semi-democratic. Semi because there was a hierarchy, but there were also elections of feast bearers at different levels. And then the fact that the guilds, very important, called usually ganas or shrenis, which were organizations of traders, farmers, craftsmen, and moneylenders. These were the four main occupations of guilds. And these were professional associations. Today we would call them associations. Though they were competing, the traders were competing against each other, yet they were also collaborating, cooperating within these guilds, sharing information on the markets, for example, who needs what, where, and on maybe the currency exchanges, who knows. And the guilds were actually very powerful, to the point that the rulers were not supposed to interfere with their bylaws. This is said here in this very early text. You see that they have authority to lay their own rules. And the king was not supposed to interfere with that. They were kind of autonomous bodies. And why should the king interfere? If this helps the trade prosper and be more efficient, why should he? He actually will benefit because he can raise more taxes at the end of the day. And therefore, some historians, I will not read this quote, have concluded that actually there is a strong democratic trend in the Indian society, and it's also a trend of self-organization. You see, at the end of the day, the geography is too vast, the social diversity is too vast, the ethnic diversity also is too vast. You cannot expect, one ruler, however mighty he might be, like Ashoka, for example, to actually rule and control everything that happens on this land. You have to allow people some right to self-organize, and this is what's going to happen. So this is actually why, you have somebody like the past US President Nixon, who once made this famous remark that India is an ungovernable country. And the point was that many people in the West could not understand how this country was not falling apart. It's not falling apart precisely because there is this depth of traditions that, people are not going to just create a revolution overnight. They have trust in some other ways for their democracy to express itself. So this has to be well understood. It's not a 1947 creation. Of course, India today is a modern nation, but this concept of modern nation is just 300 years, or not even. It comes out of the French Revolution and similar events in Europe, which defined the nation state as, having defined borders, a constitution, two chambers of parliament, and so on and so forth. So the ancient Indian concept was different, but it had its own democratic foundations. The third is peaceful cultural integration across India. This is something that actually starts with the Harappan civilization again, but limited to the northwest. We will see this similar phenomenon occurring and basically integrating India as one unit. You see, some people say India was never a country. It was many countries. Politically, it's not quite true. I'll show why. But even if there were many kingdoms from time to time, the fact is that there was an underlying cultural unity that held this country together. Otherwise, it would have fallen apart again. So we say unity in diversity. This is something that, India's first Prime Minister Nehru used to write about. But we are all aware of the diversity. We are not quite sufficiently able to understand what is that unity. So this is what again made India as one entity. And you have very early texts like this Vishnu Purana who give the whole geographic unity of India, but then the cultural unity also is going to become very clear. And this is what ultimately is the cement that made foreign travelers to India, whether they were Greek travelers, Roman travelers, Chinese travelers, Arab travelers, they describe India as one thing. They don't describe India as many different separate countries. For them, this unity is very obvious in their, their travelogues. So this concept is clear, and India was called Bharata, or it was called Jambudvipa, that is to say the island of the jamun fruit. This is how, for example, Ashoka refers to India in his edicts, his inscriptions. He says Jambudvipa. It means the whole of the subcontinent. So there are many ways by which this unity is created. Some of it is the creation of course, trade. Then you have also monks traveling all over the place, and you have also pilgrimages. Pilgrimage used to be a very, very important institution in India that kind of compelled people to travel, from east to west, from north to south, and to understand the diversity of the land. Because, there was no internet, there was no way to otherwise grasp this totality that was India. So I'm not going to spend time on these pilgrimage networks, but you have a map here of one of them, the Shakti Mahapitas. It's just one illustration among many, and you can see how care was taken to scatter those pilgrimage sites of this particular network all over the Indian map. So there is an intention here. Now, it begins, as I said, in Harappan times, and the remarkable thing about this cultural integration, it is not something that anyone dictated. No emperor said, I'm going to culturally integrate this landmass. It happened on its own organically. It had no authority. And there were several tools, one of which is the literature. The two epics. What do I mean by the two epics? I hope many of you understand what I mean. Mahabharata and Ramayana. These texts are very, very largely responsible for the cultural integration of India. There are other mechanisms, as I said, but these two texts are found from the remote northeast to the far south in all kinds of adaptations, and they've been adopted wholesale by the entire population of India, in fact, even beyond. Ramayana is known all the way to Indonesia and Cambodia and beyond, and the same with Mahabharata. So these texts actually kind of transformed Asia, the character of Asia, along with other things like, of course, Buddhism, the teachings of the Buddha, and parts of Hindu thought, and so on. So this is something that had a great rippling effect, and ultimately was again not dictated by any, it was not a deliberate intention of anybody, it just happened organically. And the beauty of it is, because it happened organically, it did not have to destroy any local culture. You see, Christianity developed by converting previous religions. You have no pre-Christian religion left in Europe. People are trying to revive the Celtic religion, but that's a modern phenomenon. You have no pre-Islamic or almost no pre-Islamic religion in the Islamic world. These two religions, monotheistic religions, spread by converting, through whatever means, the existing religions. In India, this phenomenon never happened. It was always spreading over the pre-existing cultures, but in full respect of the pre-existing cultures. They were not stamped out. They were fusions at all regional levels, which created even more diversity. So, therefore, well, I'm going to skip this in the interest of time. But see, for example, I was referring to Mahabharata. Here on the left, I don't know if you can see this map, you have a few, because the map would be too crowded otherwise, a few of the important kingdoms mentioned in Mahabharata. Once again, you can see they cover the entire map of India. In fact, all the way to Afghanistan. And you see that in addition, there are people in these kingdoms. And Mahabharata, which some anthropologists have called the first ethnographic project of India, or the first anthropological project of India, lists 363 ethnic groups, people. Today we don't even list as many as that. Of course, we know there are many castes and communities, but in terms of peoples, ethnic entities, this is a remarkable achievement of the text. So it is aware of the diversity of the whole subcontinent, in fact much bigger than today, because it includes Bangladesh, it includes Pakistan, it includes Afghanistan. It's quite aware of that diversity, and in return, all these people will adopt these texts. So this is some of the mechanisms that we have to understand if we want to really understand ancient India. Now, you know, as I repeat, some of the slogans today is that India was never a country. It was the British who achieved India's political unity. Have you ever, please raise your hand, those of you who have heard this at school or anywhere, that it was the British who created, you know, India's political unity. Have you heard it? Yes, a few hands are raised, yes. Well, look at this. This is a rough map, rough because we're never quite sure of the exact boundaries, and they would have been fluctuating also in time. But this is a rough map of the extent of the Mauryan Empire. It's bigger than today's India, okay? And because it goes all the way to Afghanistan. Maybe the map is slightly exaggerated here and there, but anyway, it's bigger. Except for what is today Tamil Nadu and Kerala, again roughly, it has the whole of India. So there was political unity, but of course this empire crumbled, disintegrated after it ran its course, and without the strong personalities like Ashoka, and eventually smaller empires, you know, kept reforming, then again disintegrated. There's a whole back and forth flow of empire building in India. But there was a concept of political unity, and later rulers were kind of aware of it and always trying to recreate that unity, though not succeeding. Now, we've seen within India that this whole culture spreads without any warfare. The warfare exists in the historical period, but it's completely at a political level. It's one king wanting to, you know, enlarge his kingdom for whatever reasons. There is warfare, but not culturally driven. And it's the same, interestingly, with the other civilizations. So here we are back to what Professor Prabhakar showed earlier, the interaction of the Indus or Harappan civilization with other civilization towards the west. In the east, you can see the Ganges, sometimes called Ganges civilization, but that's actually 2000 years later. That is the historical phase. So on the west, again, peaceful interaction, but this continues in the historical period. And we see through a lot of trade all the way to the Mediterranean world and the Roman Empire, but also eastward with all of Southeast Asia, and then northward with Central Asia, we see huge trade-based or religion-based interaction. Religion-based because, for example, China invited Buddhist monks and scholars from India. It's not that Indian went out to China to convert the Chinese to Buddhism, not at all. It was the Chinese who themselves wanted to learn, and they invited, and then they sent their own scholars to India in return. So this is all, again, a peaceful interaction. Why is it so? We have to, you know, ponder over these questions. The answers are not simple. They are very deep questions, right? And you see the spread, therefore, of Buddhism. Now, this itself would be a huge topic all over Asia, basically. And even in parts of the Mediterranean world, its presence was perceived. This is one of the two destroyed Buddhas of Bamiyan in northern Afghanistan, which was actually, if you see the small, what looks like small dots at the base of the mountain, these were actually cells for the monks. This was not just for the two statues, it was a thriving center of Buddhist learning where texts of Buddhism were being translated into all kinds of languages. This is actually a major crossroads in Central Asia. And you see here one of the famous Chinese pilgrims coming to India, Xuanzang, and actually, thankfully leaving us with a very rich and very important testimony, travelogue. And he goes back from India with gifts from King Harsha. And what are the gifts on the elephant back? The gifts are manuscripts. He even gives us a list of the manuscripts, how many manuscripts he's taking back to China, and we even know how many he will translate from Sanskrit into old Mandarin language. So this was what they wanted, not gold and jewels, maybe there was a few, I don't know, but the knowledge. They came to India for the knowledge, and they then, you know, propagated it elsewhere. This is an endless topic. I can just show you this one slide of the largest Hindu temple in the world, which is not in India, it's in Cambodia. This is at Angkor Wat. The whole complex is, I think, more than 1 kilometer in each side, but this is a colossal temple, with the size of which is many, many times the largest temple that you might find in India. And even all the way to, this is in Indonesia, this is about Bhagavad Gita, because it's not just Buddhism, it's also Hinduism, though I would like to caution that our labels, modern labels, you know, Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism, create artificial barriers. In the ancient Indian mind, there was a lot of fluidity between these schools of thought. So here you see Sri Krishna on the left of the tree, preaching Arjuna on the right. It's a completely different context, but it is still the Bhagavad Gita. And all the way to Japan, this is actually a Vedic kunda, Homa kunda, where you know, fire sacrifice is happening. And if some of you are familiar with Indian iconography, the symbol just below the flames is the Vajra of Indra, the lightning bolt. Anyway, it's an endless story, as I said. Even in the West, some scholars have detected influences from India. This is a Celtic figurine showing a deity in Padmasana, in lotus position, with 4 swastikas. And, you know, Celtic scholars have brought out all the parallels with ancient Indian concepts. And therefore, there's still a lot of, you know, possibility of studying India's influence, which was acknowledged by a lot of scholars, especially Muslim scholars during the 8th, 9th, 10th century, all the way to the 12th century, have left very glowing testimonies about India's cultural contributions, their innovations, and, you know, their gifts to the world, you might say. So let me shift now to India's perspective of nature. This is something which is another very important practice which derives from certain philosophical concepts of how human beings relate to nature. This is something that we need more and more. And you have today a lot of, you know, ecological thinkers who are going back to those ancient Indian concepts, saying that we need them because we are facing a very severe environmental crisis. And I'm afraid that all of you will witness the severity even much more after 10, 20, 30 years, and your children perhaps even much more. And more people are asking, what are we doing with nature? Are we really relating to the natural world as we should be? Or else, why are we inflicting such destruction? So there are many concepts which can be very useful, and in particular, you know, the fact that there is no hierarchy in the Indian concept between the heavens and the earth. They are both on the same level. The whole earth, the whole of nature, the whole of creation is equally divine, equally sacred. There is no difference between the two. So you have hymn after hymn in the ancient texts like the Vedas, constantly speaking of heaven and earth together. In fact, they are even fused into a single deity somewhere in the Rig Veda. And then this comparison of the universe with a tree with 1,000 branches. What is that symbol? It's simple. The tree has one trunk, that is a unity. You know, one trunk, one set of roots. But it has infinitely diverse branches. You know, no two branches are alike. So this is unity in diversity. And for that reason, the concept of sacred trees, sacred rivers, here you have the image of Ganga and Yamuna personified as goddesses. You see how they are carrying the pot of water, so they are the rivers, and you can see how they are riding the vahanas, which are one gharial or Gangetic crocodile and a tortoise. So the whole iconography is about water-based animals and water, and they are goddesses. They are to be worshipped. Why are they to be worshipped? Because rivers are life-giving. Today we have been killing a lot of rivers in India. So many rivers have become seasonal. From the Western Ghats, for example, there are so few perennial rivers left. Even Himalayan rivers are slowly getting intermittent, seasonal. So we have to ask those questions. Are we really dealing with these natural resources as we should be? And of course, sacred forest. There is a whole tradition of sacred groves in India, especially all along the Western Ghats in the northeast, and where basically these are pockets of forest where no destructive activity, whether it is hunting or even cutting of wood, is allowed. And these are local communities, often tribals or rural communities, villages basically, handling and preserving these forests, and you will have some shrines like here and some rituals. So, and this concept is widespread. It's not limited to a few Sanskrit texts. I'm taking here a Tamil text, the Tirukural. If we have any Tamil students here, I hope you will know something about it. And Tiruvarruvar, who was the author of the Quran, has this surprising thought in perhaps 500 AD. He says sparkling water, open space, hills and forests constitute a fortress. What is a fortress? It's a defense. That is, this is our defense. We are defended by nature. Nature is our defense. If we spoil it, then we will be defenseless. I'm extrapolating a bit. Then a lot of water management, because you deal with nature but in a non-destructive way, and you can still harvest its. So this is what Dr. Prabhakar showed us from the Harappan civilization. But all this highly skilled water management with a lot of engineering techniques which are not well understood even today is visible all through the historical period, right up to the colonial period. In fact, very often the British colonial rule destroyed those structures because they were not able to understand them anymore. This structure of several interconnected tanks at Sringverpur in Uttar Pradesh is not actually well understood. The archaeologist, Professor Bibilal, proposed a mechanism, but IIT Kanpur is still conducting research, and they're not convinced that they have really understood how this whole system works. The whole point is that India, having different climates, different regions, developed a wide variety of different water structures for its needs, and therefore developed a very practical management of these resources, but they were not wasteful. And today, a number of people, are trying to understand the practices and the behind this management, so that we can have a less wasteful use of our waters. But unfortunately, the lessons are not really learned. So the practical attitude are, first of all, sacredness of creation and all, whether it's mountains, rivers or forest, interconnectedness of all creature. This is a philosophical context common to Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, that we are all interconnected, even with very humble creatures. So all animals, all plants are like, part of us, and we have to deal with them respectfully, which of course we do not. Therefore, we can milk nature, but we should not. You see, this conquest of nature is very much a Western notion. You conquer the Everest, you conquer the North Pole. In the Indian literature, you don't have this idea of conquering. It's living with. It's not about conquering. Respect of all life forms, and finally, simplicity of living. It's not about ascetic living. It's about living with what you really need, and not collecting cars because it gives you a status in society. It's just, if you need one car, okay, you have one car, and you're happy with it. So a certain frugality of living, and which is exactly the opposite of, you know, the philosophy of consumption today. Our consumption-driven economy, on the contrary, is always trying to convince you that you need this junk food, you need that additional car, you need to have a luxurious house, and so on. So there is here a different spirit altogether, and we may have to go back to it. Now I'll move more quickly towards a few master ideas, and they don't really need much development. One is this: it looks like philosophical, but you can touch it in the society today in India, if you know how to relate to it. One is this concept of Svabhava. What is Svabhava? Self-nature. It means that your nature and mine are not the same. They are different. And therefore, we need a Svadharma. That is to say, dharma is not necessarily the same. There may be some common dharma for all, but your dharma is different from mine because we are different. So therefore, this leads to freedom of approaches, freedom of selecting one's path. It means that there cannot be one path for all. This is exactly the opposite of what the great monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, said. That there is one truth and the whole of humanity has to adopt it. No, in India it's the opposite. It's not even desirable. It's desirable that you should find your own truth and I should find mine. We should, and then therefore we're going to be able to coexist. So people say, well, Indians are very tolerant. I don't like this word. Tolerance is a very patronizing word. You know, I tolerate you. Just barely, perhaps. That's not a good concept. It was developed again in the West because initially there was so much intolerance, especially in the history of Christianity and Islam. So in India, there's no need of this concept of tolerance. There's an automatic acceptance that you are different from me. I accept that you have your own dharma, I have mine, and we can coexist. That's the idea behind pluralism. I can skip this. This is what I... Now, this itself is a huge topic. This idea that, which is important to be mentioned, simply to challenge this idea that Indians, ancient Indians, were, you know, concerned with spirituality, religion, and not much with things which are relevant to today. You will be surprised if you study this. I used to give a course, a semester course on this at IIT Gandhinagar, of how much of technological and scientific realizations were made in India. So this itself is a colossal topic. I can't go into it. I can just show you this map of mathematicians and astronomers of ancient India. And there are many, many, many more whose names are barely recorded in manuscripts. And even the manuscripts which have been studied are very few. About 7% of the wealth of scientific manuscripts has been studied. 93%, at least in South India, still is yet to be read. And yet we know how much of mathematics and astronomy great figures like Aryabhata, like Brahmagupta, Bhaskaracharya, and so many others developed. So there's a lot of scholarly material on this, and it's non-controversial. It's very well known. But unfortunately, it has not yet propagated to the popular mind and to the student community. Because why should you as student not be told of these advances when they are very solidly established from the texts themselves? Why should you be kept in ignorance of the kind of advances that Indian mathematicians and astronomers did? School level, for example, up to class 10 or so, most of the maths that you learn up to class 9 or 10 is actually maths that was developed by 1200, or let us say, if we include the Kerala School of Mathematics, by 1600 or so. So long before the colonial rule. So this is one thing that will show you that there's, you know, a wide diversity of things that Indians were interested in. And of course, all the technologies. I have not repeated what was said earlier. This is something which again derives from the, let us say, Indian philosophy. Because all of nature is sacred, because there's no difference between the divine world and the terrestrial creation, Therefore, we should try to find this divinity everywhere. And you will find that a lot of art and literature is actually aiming at spiritualizing life. So you have these amazing monuments and heritage of India, and I hope you can recognize some of them, which mean that, you know, technologies like architecture. Architecture is the technology, but it's also an art, or painting, or music, or dance, or, you know, all the arts have this kind of spiritual foundation, right? And that's why scholars have spoken of the sacred arts of India, because there is this attempt to embody this sacred divine context. So these are just a few images, but of course it's a colossal topic in itself. And once again, this concept propagated beyond India. This is actually from Indonesia, in Prambanan, and I showed you already Angkor Wat earlier. And then you have this whole philosophy there. See, the temple is not just a building. It's much more than that. It's actually a representation of the whole universe, but also the whole human being. And therefore, you have the feet of the temple, the body and the head of the temple, which represent this cosmic being, which is ultimately the universe. So there's a whole philosophy, very elaborate, and this is pushed into, naturally, into all the arts and much of the literature. Now, we speak today of personality development. At least it is accepted in the educational world, you know, that education should not be just for cramming your brains with all kinds of data, but also to develop your personality. Well, this is something that has been at the center of the Indian concern for a long, long time. It has many names. The simplest name is yoga. Yoga is what? It's, as I define it, a system of self-exploration, self-discovery. You have to discover yourself, and self-fulfillment. You have to reach fulfillment in life. You have to do something with your life that brings you happiness, satisfaction. You know, there's even a word for satisfaction, trupti. Trupti is a very important concept. So all this is part of the Indian journey, which perhaps begins in the Harappan civilization. I mean, this is a bit conjectural, but perhaps, you know, this figure is in deep contemplation, and you do have various other figures which have been associated with some practice, early practice of yoga. A little later, we find this kind of archaeological remains. You know, this is a skeleton, probably about 1000 BC in Rajasthan, buried in Padmasana. What does it mean exactly? Well, probably something, but anyway, cutting the long journey short, this is the ultimate outcome. And these are, you know, covers of Time magazine a few years ago, where basically they document the spread of yoga in America, in the US. And yoga has actually spread all over the world. Why has it spread all over the world? Clearly, not just because of some physical, you know, postures, asanas. You have a lot of gymnastics also in the West. There's some deeper need that yoga really addresses and that every human being has deep down. Now, finally, 2-3 very quick concepts which are and achievements which are remarkable. One is that something happened in the 19th century. 19th century, as you know, is the summit of the colonial rule in India. The British finally have conquered by 1830s, 1840s. They have completed their conquest of India. So India is completely dominated politically. Culturally, it's almost the opposite that's going to happen. First of all, there is a kind of reawakening, and sometimes it has been called Renaissance, happening from Bengal onward, and it spreads all over India. And we have a number of great figures like Bankim Chandra, Tagore, Subramaniam Bharati in the south, but then also in the arts and in the sciences. You've heard, I hope, of Jagdish Chandra Bose. You've heard of Prafulla Chandra Ray, the great chemist, C.V. Raman, S. Ramanujan, and so many others. So there is a ferment, and things are happening. There are also social reformers, And then there is, at the back of all this, there is a spiritual renaissance. Great figures happen, like Ramakrishna, like Vivekananda, like Sri Aurobindo, and many more. So all this is actually rejuvenating the Indian society. And it's not doing just this. I will have to skip these beautiful quotations in the interest of time. It's not just this. It is also that this actually starts spreading again beyond India. What happens is that Europeans have conquered India. Then they take the texts because they want to understand the foundations of Indian culture. So the manuscripts of the Vedas, Mahabharata, Ramayana, Upanishads, Gita, and so on are all carried to Western, European, first of all, libraries. And then scholarship begins. And you have a lot of great Indologists, European, who start translating the Vedas and all these texts into European languages. And then there's a tremendous amount of impact on European culture. And well, I have a few quotations here, but I will skip them. In fact, this itself occupies a big volume where you can see how European literature, poetry, philosophy was influenced by Indian concepts and ideas. It was also fresh and new for a lot of European thinkers. And what was remarkable is that Indian philosophy, spirituality, if you wish to call it, it's both together, is compatible with modern science, which is galloping in those days. You see, in the West, there was a clash. For example, with Darwin, I hope you know the story of Darwin. When he propagated his concept of origin of species, the evolution of species through natural selection, he came into a clash with the church, because the church has this dogma that the universe was created in 4004 BC, and it was a sudden creation with all the species instantly there. Instantly. This is what Genesis says. Well, Darwin could not agree with this, and therefore he became an atheist. But he had to fight a lot of resistance from Christian thinkers, and also scientists in those days still very much influenced by Christian theology. This problem never happened in India, because the ground was already prepared for broad, flexible concepts with huge scales of time and huge diversity, and there was no such clash. So therefore, and even the concept of the atom was there, and some kind of concept of evolution. If some of you, if I say Dashavatars of Vishnu, you might understand what I mean. And it's not Darwinian evolution, it is simply a concept which can be connected to it. So this actually made, in fact, a number of Western scientists, some of you who study physics may have heard the name of Tesla, Schrödinger, Heisenberg, Oppenheimer, Bohm, David Bohm, and others, and all of them were fascinated by Indian philosophy. Many of them read very assiduously. Schrödinger wrote about Vedanta because they found that between this philosophy and the discoveries of relativity or quantum physics, there were bridges, and they found inspiration in this. So this is something which we omit usually, but it's important. Finally, and I'll close with this, the resilience. Why is it that out of all ancient civilizations of the world, the Greek, the Egyptian, the Chinese, the Japanese, African civilizations, we never hear about them. There were brilliant Bronze Age civilizations in Africa, deep in Africa, and of course in the Americas. How is it that out of all of these, only the Indian civilization survives with some sufficient degree of continuity? I am not saying it is total continuity, of course not. There has to be a lot of changes in the course of time. Things have disappeared, new things have appeared. But how is it that we can still speak of the stream of Indian civilization? Well, precisely because of all of that I have shown you before, and much more that there was no time to go into. So therefore, I will close with this, that, oh yes, before I close, I also wanted to show a few things that India did not contribute to the world. This is just for fun. Wars of religion. they were devastating Europe for a long time, especially in the Middle Ages. There were no wars of religion in India. There were clashes, there were doctrinal rivalries, there were some bitter exchanges, but you don't have an army waging war against another part of the country to impose a particular religion. It doesn't happen. Colonial conquest or plunder, of course not. Slave trade has not existed in India. No genocides as far as we know. And no concentration camps and no world wars originated out of India. So you can see that my whole point is that I'm not trying to say India is great, the West is not. No, I'm not interested in saying that this is superior, this is inferior. That's not at all my point. My point is that it's a different kind of civilization. And we have to understand what drove it, what made it kick, and ultimately what allowed it to survive to some extent. Thank you very much.